on evidence-based decision-making, including work in the area of public health. Since receiving his PhD, Dr. Phillips has been a professor of public health at the University of Minnesota, the University of Texas, and most recently at the University of Alberta. In 2010, he created an independent research institute where he continues his studies. Over the past few years, Dr. Phillips has been studying the health impacts associated with wind turbines. He has several ongoing research projects on the issue and has written professional papers covering the topic. Dr. Phillips has also conducted numerous presentations, including participating in a landmark Canadian hearing that may result in a major policy change. Through the course of his work, he has collected and analyzed data on hundreds of people who have suffered adverse health effects from nearby turbines. With that, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Phillips. Thank you.
Would you please come forward so I can swear you in? Sure. I do solemnly swear by the ever-living God that the testimony I'm about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. Yes. Please sign and print your name here, sir. Okay, thank you. The floor is yours. You have 1 hour that you can use.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you for having me here.
Can you get a little closer to the mic? So
sorry, is it on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Towards you.
Just
toward the switch.
Sorry. It's not. Okay. Lean forward. All right. As Steve said, I am a professor of public health by career, though currently I'm running my own independent research institute. My educational background is in public policy and economics. I did postdocs in public health and the philosophy of science. When I was a professor, my teaching primarily focused on how to properly interpret epidemiologic evidence and how to make optimal policy decisions based on that evidence, considering ethical questions as well as trying to make the best possible sense of what we know scientifically. During the time that I was a professor, I won various awards and recognition for both new research and teaching. As Steve already mentioned, epidemiology is the study of actual health outcomes in people. And the reason that that's significant is because there are many health sciences that look at questions of what might have negative impacts on people obliquely. So toxicology looks at what happens to cells or other animals or in a test tube. But it doesn't tell us exactly what's going to happen to people, which is critical because the human body, the human mind, and the world of exposures that we face are extremely complicated. And the only way to really know for sure what's going to happen to people is by observing them. And so only epidemiology does that. It, in some sense, trumps toxicology, which we often have to deal with in epidemiology, or, for that matter, the study of acoustics, something that doesn't show up all that often with regard to human health effects, but is, of course, a key science for understanding the effect of wind turbines. The acoustics science may suggest that we have a problem or may suggest that we don't, depending on who you ask. But as I will present to you this evening, the epidemiology very clearly indicates that there are serious health problems involved when we cite industrial wind turbines near residences. My involvement in this topic started early last year. Most of my work has been on other topics, and in fact, if you look me up, you'll find that most of my work is on the area of tobacco harm reduction. But my expertise and speciality is really making sense of complex bodies of epidemiologic evidence. There's no simple way to do that. Epidemiology is an extremely complicated science. There's no cookie cutter, there's no recipe, there's no way to just pick up a textbook and figure it out, even though sometimes someone might try to tell you that that's the case. So I focused on trying to make sense of the most complicated bodies of evidence, and this certainly qualifies as one of them. I also have a background in environmental health. I taught environmental health for several years, and in energy economics, which has obvious usefulness for this particular topic. So I was asked to evaluate a case like this in Wisconsin early last year. And since that time, I've given either oral or written testimony to various tribunals, courts, boards like this, about a dozen times in 4 different countries. I've published recently one article about how best to interpret this evidence in the journal Bulletin of Science, Technology, and Society. I've written several other analyses. I've done research collecting the adverse event reports, a term that I will explain in a few minutes, trying to put together a database of those that can be useful for further research, and am in the process of starting a survey research project on the topic. I believe I've read pretty much all of the health science journal articles and summary reports by governments and others that have been written about this topic that seem to have much bearing. But most important, and I hope I can communicate that in my presentation today, I've reviewed hundreds of these adverse event reports, and that's where we find the really compelling evidence about what's going on here. So just to summarize my key opinions professionally about this topic before I get into looking at the evidence and explaining that, first and foremost, there's overwhelming evidence that these wind turbines cause substantial health problems for nearby residents. The problems seem to consist primarily of sleep disorders, mood disorders, fatigue, headache, difficulty concentrating, and other problems that are typically associated with what we call severe stress reactions or syndromes, which also can include life-threatening effects like hypertension, although that is difficult for people to observe themselves, and there's a limited amount of measurement of that so far to date. There are also many reports of vestibular system problems, that is balance problems, and tinnitus, ringing in the ears. This is a class of health problems that are often not well quantified in terms of how much of these are prevalent in the population, but most estimates from public health organizations say that these are enormously important in terms of overall health and well-being in our society and throughout the world. One limitation of what we know right now is that there is not enough of the right kind of research that allows us to estimate that numbers like 7% of the population at this distance from this type of wind turbine is going to have a problem. There are studies that could let us do that, but unfortunately nobody's funded those yet. But there is ample evidence that I think makes it fairly safe to conclude that something in the neighborhood of 5% of those within a mile or more of turbines are going to suffer substantial, and by that I mean serious, health problems, and that many more than that suffer disruptions in their lives and health that are less severe, but are still quite costly when they are all added up. If wind turbines were a pharmaceutical or some other chemical that industry was about to release onto the public, exposing tens of thousands of people to it, we wouldn't be in the position where we are right now, having to try to piece together the evidence we have, because they would have been required, that is, the industry would have been required to do the necessary research to figure out what I was just describing. In this case, unfortunately, not only have they not been required to do the research, but frankly, they've done a pretty good job of keeping anyone from getting it done. Nevertheless, we do know quite a lot about this, thanks to the exposures that have been inflicted on people and their own reporting of what's been happening to them. It's also important to know scientifically that we don't know exactly what's causing the problem. Now, of course, we know that is the operation of the wind turbines. But wind turbines create audible noise, they create sub-audible noise, they create vibrations through the ground, and on occasion, shadow flicker. All of these are potentially problems that create stress reactions and other health problems in people. It would be nice to know exactly which one of these had the effect, because of course then we could perhaps redesign the equipment to avoid the problem. We know exactly what it would take to avoid having this happen to nearby residents. We simply do not know this. However, what we do know is that there is definitely evidence of a problem, and anyone who claims that there's no evidence that there's health problems either has a very poor understanding of what constitutes scientific evidence or is simply trying to mislead. Just because we don't know everything that we'd like to know about these effects does not mean that we don't know anything. And to that point, my analysis follows the following outline. First, I'm going to point out how and why that there's a substantial amount of epidemiologic evidence of health effects in the form of these adverse event reports, although there are also several systematic studies. Second, I'm going to explain why when we look at the details of this particular exposure and disease outcome, as opposed to many others that are actually quite a bit harder to study in some ways, the evidence becomes even more convincing and stands up very well to criticisms that have been leveled against its validity. I'm going to argue that these health effects are serious and important for people's well-being, and that attempts to dismiss them as not real diseases simply don't stand up to scrutiny. And I'm going to address the fact that the causal relationship is simply quite plausible. In fact, I'll just make that point now and not belabor it. We know that energy from these turbines reaches the human body of a person who is a mile or even a mile and a half, possibly even 2 miles away from them. We don't know why this causes disruptions to the body or the brain. Many people have very strongly held theories about exactly what the mechanism is. As an epidemiologist, that's not where I come in. I don't know exactly why these problems exist, but I do know that the evidence is there that they do exist, and it's quite plausible given the nature of the exposure. As an aside, I've written point by point, on various occasions, I've written point-by-point rebuttals of several of the major pro-industry reports, and I obviously can't go through them standing up here doing an oral presentation. You wouldn't want me to. But I can summarize a few key observations about these reports, because I suspect that many of you have seen these, reviewed them, and paid attention to them. First off, most importantly, these reports consistently pretend that the vast majority of the existing evidence, these event reports, doesn't exist. And again, I'll go into this at some length. Second, they claim that because we cannot figure out exactly how and why this exposure is causing these disease outcomes, that therefore there must not be any problem. Now, I think it should be fairly clear that science doesn't work that way. After all, we didn't know exactly why, we still don't know exactly why smoking causes lung cancer, but we've been quite sure that smoking causes lung cancer for about 60 years now. We're only now figuring out some of the reasons why smoking causes heart disease, even though we've known that it causes heart disease for almost that long, and yet the research goes on to figure out exactly what the mechanism there. There's nothing unusual about the complicated body and the difficult path of medical or epidemiologic research. There's nothing unusual about the fact that we see that there's a problem without actually knowing exactly what the causal pathway, to use the jargon, is from the exposure to the disease. And finally, these reports, often even as they pretend that there's no evidence of health effects, tend to denigrate the nature of the health effects that actually occur, something that I'll go into a bit more as I go through the presentation. The epidemiologic evidence, as I've already suggested, primarily takes the form of adverse event reporting. Now, what is that? An adverse event report is the report about a single incidence of disease that seems plausibly to be tied to a particular exposure. Now, some people might denigrate this as an anecdote.